I think that osteopenia is actually really misunderstood. I think that people say, oh my gosh, I have osteopenia. Well, like I said, I have osteopenia, right? And I'm not at risk of fracture. I think that if you have a diagnosis of osteopenia, and also I was actually looking this up today, osteopenia is not actually a medical problem, right? Osteopenia is the precursor to osteoporosis. Osteopenia is potentially a problem if 2 years ago you didn't have osteopenia. Right, so you have an interval that says that you are losing bone mass quickly, and that happens. So that could be a problem. But if you have mild osteopenia and you're not at risk for fracture, this is not something to lose sleep over. So I think we have to understand it in context. Let's say your T-score is negative 1.5, like I think mine's negative 1.2 or 1.3. But it's been like that since I was 22. So over the last 20 plus years, it hasn't changed. Am I at higher risk of fracture now than I was then? Well, only because I'm 20 years older, but I don't think my bone really has changed. If anything, it's probably gotten better. You have to really take that into context. So can you slow down bone loss if you have osteopenia? Absolutely. That's honestly the easiest thing to do.
Hey there, I'm Amy Connell. Welcome to Graced Health, the podcast for women who want simple and grace-filled ways to take care of themselves and enjoy a little chocolate. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach who wants you to know your eating, movement, and body don't need to be perfect. You just need to be able to do what you're called to do. According to the CDC, I know not everybody is here in the United States, but many of you are. 19.6% of women over 50 have a prevalence of osteoporosis. That's nearly 1 in 5 women over 50. I have been learning about osteoporosis lately for my business, and once my eyes were opened to this diagnosis, I knew I needed to bring on an expert in bone health to help us understand it. And then I realized that May is Osteoporosis Awareness Month. So I thought, well, what better way to kick off May than to have this conversation? Dr. Doug Lucas joins us today to help us understand what osteoporosis is, risk factors, how genetics play a role in this, hormones and bone loss, and so much more. After finishing his training at Stanford University, Dr. Doug began medical practice as an orthopedic surgeon. So he has the history of understanding bones. He specializes in metabolic health, hormone optimization for both men and women, osteoporosis, and longevity. Dr. Doug aims to address the underlying causes of chronic disease to improve both health span and lifespan. If bone health is on your radar, this is one episode you must listen to. And if you know someone who has been perhaps diagnosed with osteopenia or osteoporosis lately, please send this on to him or onto them. Dr. Doug provides other applicable information about dietary recommendations, supplements, and creating strong muscles. I dug that part of the conversation to support your bones and just so much more. He's a wealth of information. Now, just a heads up, you will hear us discussing bone health as it relates to hormones and specifically birth control pills. I know a lot of you are in the perimenopausal, menopausal stage, and birth control pills may be something that your provider has recommended to help deal with all the hot flashes. So depending on your personal history with birth control pills, Dr. Doug's thoughts may be somewhat alarming. If they are, please discuss this with your medical provider about what the best course of action is for you and your unique medical needs and history. Do the research. And of course, if you feel like you need greater support, reach out to Dr. Doug and his team over at optimalbonehealth.com. And of course, I will have that in the show notes. Okay, let's bring on Dr. Doug. Dr. Doug, welcome to Graced Health.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me. And I love the fact that we're going to put this live in May. That's so great.
Yes. Well, it's just as a little backstory, I actually was reached out to by a client several months ago who has been diagnosed with severe osteoporosis. So I had never trained someone with this condition before. And so I went in and I thought, well, I need to get all of my CECs and all of my continuing education, and really was astounded at what there was to learn. And, people hear things and they think, well, I just need to strength train. And no, there's a lot more to it than just going to the gym and doing bicep curls, which is PS is not the answer, as you know. But I've really been fascinated by, and I don't know if you prefer to call it a condition or a life state. I don't know what the right term and the correct and gentle terminology is, but I just find it really interesting. So I searched out for someone who's an expert and who can help walk us through. I came across you, and I'm very glad that you are here.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, that it's funny because that actually mirrors exactly what happened to me as I started going into this process of being in the health optimization space after quitting my job as an orthopedic surgeon. And I was similarly kind of amazed by what was out there, but I was more amazed by what wasn't out there. And because I wasn't anticipating making this move. And then I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much to teach and to educate. And people with osteoporosis are frantic.
Yes.
I don't know about your experience with your client, but I find that people come to me and they are just frantic and so worried about this diagnosis and so afraid of the pharmacology, which they potentially should be. And we can talk about that. And they're just desperate for answers. And so that's why we created what we created, which I know we'll talk about.
Yes. And I love that. And I think our passion comes from our pain or, some other, often, something deeper. So I'm really, I'm glad that you have that. So let's kind of just pull back a little bit and bring people up to speed on osteoporosis, osteopenia, and what the difference is.
Yeah, it's so interesting where this all came from, because we have this diagnosis, and it is, I call it a diagnosis. I think that's technically the right thing to call it, because it is technically a quote unquote medical condition. But if you go back a step from there and you say, well, what is it? There's really kind of three ways to look at it. The diagnosis is all based off of one specific imaging modality, which looks at bone density. And this came up, I forget the year that this came up, but it wasn't actually that long ago, where once we had good X-ray imaging, they were able to come up with the technology to say, well, how dense are your bones? And they wanted to do this in an effort to identify who was at risk of fracture and who wasn't. And this was really before we knew really much about osteoporosis at all. And so they came up with what's called the DEXA scan, DEXA. That's what most of people that have osteoporosis and osteopenia have been diagnosed by. The problem with that is that they, not arbitrarily, but kind of arbitrarily, just put these numbers in that we now call the T-score that are going to diagnose you with quote unquote osteoporosis or osteopenia. And depending on what your T-score is will dictate what the diagnosis is. And let me just talk kind of about what that means. And so the T-score is looking at, it's looking at your bone density compared to somebody with optimal bone density in your and they kind of divide it out now by ethnicity and world region, geographic region, right? And so you can kind of put in, if you want to know what your fracture risk is, where you're from, what your ethnicity is, and then what your T-score is, and it'll give you kind of a fracture risk. The problem with that is that that's assuming, if you have a T-score that's anything under 0, it's assuming that you are comparing yourself to somebody probably in the early 20s. And anything less than, this gets confusing, but anything less than -1 is considered osteopenia. So -1 and -2.5 is osteopenia, and anything less than -2.5 is osteoporosis. And what those numbers represent are standard deviations from the mean, which is 0, which now we just talked about statistics, and that's really confusing. But basically means how much worse is your bone density than somebody of optimal bone density. And the problem with that is people get really worked up even about osteopenia. And I can tell you that I have osteopenia and I have my entire adult life. I am not at risk for fracture. I'm very confident in saying that. And so there is much, much, much more to being at risk of fracture than what your bone density is. There is an area where those two do coincide, where if your bone density gets to a certain risk threshold, then yes, you are at increased risk for fracture, but that's going to really vary based on your bone quality, and DEXA doesn't measure bone quality. So I'll kind of stop there because that was a long explanation.
Well, I think that's great. And I would love for you to dig into defining bone quality. But one thing I'm hearing you say is that optimal density is defined for like in, I think you said 25 or, maybe in your mid 20s.
Mhm.
Tell us some about why, I think I know the answer, but tell us why that's defined more at that age.
Yeah. So if we look at just bone density, just look at bone density throughout the lifespan. When we're born, our bone density is not very high, right? Because our bones are made out of collagen. They haven't calcified yet. They're literally just little rubber things. Um, so your bone density increases dramatically throughout, certainly early childhood, adolescence. It goes up and up and up. Starts to slow down as you get into early adulthood, and then it reaches a plateau. That plateau is called peak bone density. It occurs variably around, early to mid 20s in most adults. The tough thing is that amount of density that you accrue throughout childhood, adolescence, early adulthood is really dependent on your nutrition and your activity. So I just said two big things, which is kids are less active and they're eating terrible diets. And so I think we're seeing a whole lot more osteoporosis and osteopenia. And I think this is the tip of the iceberg because people are not establishing good peak bone density and they're not being screened. And we can talk about when and why to screen and what the recommendations are, but I'll just say that they're not being screened until it's way too late. So they're coming to me with severe osteoporosis and it's totally catching them by surprise.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the lifestyle that our adolescents are living is terrifying of future health. Okay, now I said I wanted to get into quality. So define quality for
Yeah.
us as it relates to this conversation.
Yeah. So when people ask me to define osteoporosis, I have to talk about DEXA because that's how most people understand it. But really, what osteoporosis is an imbalance between bone breakdown and bone building. So we have cells that build bone and we have cells that break down bone, and it is constantly fluctuating back and forth. And this is true just about every system in our body, and bones are no different. There's always a breakdown, there's always a buildup. And if you get imbalanced, bad things can happen. So that's what osteoporosis ultimately is. Now, a DEXA is an attempt to try to objectify that in some way so that we can try to understand who is at risk of fracture. I think the more we learn about DEXA, the more I realize it's not a great tool for that, but it's ultimately one of the only tools that we have, and certainly the only tool that's globally available. But bone quality is actually a combination of your density, but also your strength. So you can have not very dense bones that are very strong, and DEXA is going to tell you that you are at risk for fracture when you're not. And you can have very dense bones that are not strong, and then you're at risk for fracture, but you don't know it because your DEXA looks fine. And that's where a conversation of pharmaceuticals gets important because the pharmaceuticals, some of them are good at increasing bone density, but start to fail over time at increasing bone quality or strength. And they actually put you at increased risk for fracture if you continue down that pathway.
Okay. So when you say bone strength, I'm just digging in. I'm just like, you're giving me
Yeah,
threads.
great.
I'm just pulling and
Yeah.
pulling and pulling. So when you talk about bone strength, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I kind of use I kind of use quality and strength interchangeably, and I shouldn't. So
Okay.
so there is bone quantity and quality, right?
Mhm.
And the two together make up strength. So strength is really a combination of both how much mineralization, how much bone you have, but also the quality of that bone. And so again, if you have one side of the equation but not the other, then your strength is going to go down, and that's true either way. And that's why DEXA can be a good indicator of fracture risk, but not always. And like I said, I am potentially at risk for fracture if you look at the numbers, but I'm fairly confident that my risk of fracture is not what the FRAX score says it is.
Yes, that would make a lot of sense. Okay, thank you for for letting me kind of pull all that. So let's talk some about risks and what will put an individual. I mean, we talked about lifestyle already and how our adolescents are. That's an opportunity for improvement if you want to talk about it in a positive way.
Sure.
But
I like that.
what else? And feel free to dig into that too. But what does put an individual at risk for osteoporosis and low bone quality?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are kind of two things out of the gate that are really important. So, one is genetics, asking if you know your family history, does anybody have a history of osteoporosis or a history of fragility fracture, which is defined as a fracture as a result of poor bone quality? And you may not know the answer to that second one, but if somebody broke a hip without being in a car accident, that's a fragility fracture. right? If
Okay.
they broke their spine by coughing or sneezing, that's a fragility fracture. So number one, knowing your genetics, and that's just asking questions. And then number two, if you developed, or if the risk factor is if you didn't develop peak bone density of any substantial amount, and that's hard to know because again, we're not screening adolescents and early adults. I am, but most people aren't. And so you don't necessarily know that unless you've been screened for some reason. Now, I was screened with a DEXA in my early 20s because my wife was doing her PhD thesis in body composition. So I had a DEXA and I had osteopenia. I didn't even know what that meant.
Was
Um,
that was that when you found out about that?
well, yeah, but I didn't even think about it until I recently had another study, which we can talk about, which is an ultrasound study called REMS, and it showed I had osteopenia, and it's actually about the same, which I wouldn't expect it to change. And so I went back and I still had that old result from my DEXA from, it was actually, I was in medical school. And yeah, and so I did learn about it then because I was screened. It's mild, and I'm not worried about it. But it just goes to show that even me as at that point in time, I was, 210 pounds, relatively fit individual with osteopenia. You wouldn't think that, right? Like you wouldn't think that I would be at risk for that based off of just, looking at a relatively fit muscular individual.
Sure. Yeah. And I agree. And I think too, there's a perception that like I talk a lot about how, we have our health is a very holistic thing, right? You can't just look at someone and go, oh yeah, well they're healthy or they're not healthy, and that can go either way. And so that makes sense too, that you can't always just visually assess what your bone health is
Yeah.
based off of even factors that you may assume.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, you talk about genetics and asking questions. Is there anything else that we need to, any specific questions we should be asking? Let's start with that in terms of digging into our genetics and risk factors.
Yeah, really just from a genetics perspective, just those two things. Did they have a diagnosis and did they have a fragility fracture? But other risk factors, yeah, I kind of stopped short there. So there's a really long list of risk factors that if you're wondering, am I at risk for a fracture or am I potentially at risk for osteoporosis? What are the things that I could have done in my life to precipitate that? There is a long list, and I'll just hit some of the highlights. And so I talk to people, have you ever had gut dysfunction? And by gut dysfunction, I mean, have you ever had things like SIBO? Do you have ulcerative colitis, Crohn's? Any reason why your gut's not absorbing nutrients the way that it should? And that's actually a whole lot of people. Most people don't know it, but that's a whole lot of people, as you probably know. Were you ever a smoker? Not as common now in our young adults, but certainly in the baby boomer population, that's pretty common, right? Were you ever on steroids for any particular reason for any prolonged period of time? And by prolonged, I mean over 10 days, which is actually a lot of people. Steroids as a drug can really have an impact on bone loss very, very quickly. So imagine people that are on chronic steroids for autoimmune conditions. They're really at high risk for bone loss. And going back to the gut dysfunction, another thing that you'll see as a risk factor listed is, have you ever had an eating disorder? And when I look at this, I think of, yes, of course, people that have had severe eating disorders that are potentially diagnosable. Yes, they're at risk because they're certainly nutrient depleted. But what I know about diet and nutrition is that most people are nutrient depleted. And if people have been chronically dieting their whole life, they're really nutrient depleted. And so I think that encompasses a whole lot of people. Sedentary lifestyle is a risk factor. There's a whole bunch of drugs, particularly drugs for acid reflux, PPIs in particular, are really common, and that's a big one.
Are there any particular ethnicities that are more susceptible than others?
Mm-hmm. So Caucasian is the background that are the highest risk, and then there is a whole stratification, and I can't think of what the risks are at the top of my head, so I shouldn't say them.
That's okay. Okay. So a lot of my community are women, or a lot is, I never know the right grammar.
Mm-hmm.
Women 40s, 50s, 60s, kind of pushing beyond 60s into 70s. And of course, we're right in this phase where our hormones are, like for me, I'm 48, so my hormones are kind of going wonky. Some people's are starting to steady out. Let's talk some about hormones and how they affect bone loss, bone health, bone quality.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And that's a big risk factor I didn't mention. So if you've ever been, well, the way that it's listed, I believe, is if you've had abnormal hormones. I forget how they list it exactly, but for me, what that means is any woman that's been on hormone replacement, or any woman that's been, I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Any woman that's been on oral birth control with a progestin, not a progesterone, which is every one that I'm aware of, those women are all at risk for osteoporosis. And I'll just speak to that a little bit, which is most of the oral birth control will have an impact on your cycle. Obviously, that's why you take it. The progestin stops the natural surge of the natural progesterone. That natural progesterone is part of the back and forth pull throughout your life of estrogen and progesterone, and that has an impact on your bones as well. Progesterone stimulates osteoblasts; those are the cells that build bone. And so, if you're blunting that progesterone surge every month as an adult, you can imagine that's going to have an impact on your bones. So I include any kind of hormone dysfunction, including being on oral birth control, and I'm a big advocate for getting off birth control.
Well, okay. So let me ask you this, and I know this isn't specifically your area of expertise, but it's all related. Many gynecologists or menopause physicians or providers will recommend women have birth controls to help with menopausal symptoms.
Sure.
So if someone is listening and they're like, wait, I'm trying to manage my menopause so I'm not crazy. Yeah. And so I'm not having hot flashes at 3 a.m. and I can sleep, but you're telling me to get off. I'm like, yeah. But because if I don't, then I'm going to be degrading my bone loss. Like, what am I supposed to do? So as much as you feel comfortable within your scope of practice, speak to that, please.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I've done 2 fellowships on hormones, so I feel very comfortable in talking about this. Now, that said, I will make angry a lot of people by saying what I'm about to say. OBGYNs are the experts in the traditional medical model on women's hormones because it's what they do. The thing is that it is what they do, but it's generally not what they're interested in. And I'm not saying that because of the field as a whole, but I'm saying that as the OBGYNs that I know, and I know a lot of them, they do hormone either replacement or utilize oral birth control as part of their practice because it's just part of the scope in which they live in. But it's not really what they want to do. They're interested in either women's health, reproductive health, all the things, or babies. It's the OB part, right? So they kind of get pigeonholed into I need you to manage my hormones, but in general, they are more likely to just follow the guidelines from ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and those guidelines do talk about using oral contraceptives to manage perimenopause. And it's easy, right? You don't have to worry about any kind of specific dosing. The risks are very clear. And a lot of those women were on them earlier in their life, so they're comfortable with it. So it's just a very easy conversation. And then once they are through perimenopause and they're actually postmenopausal, putting them on some kind of hormone replacement becomes controversial. And then ACOG guidelines say use the lowest dose possible for the shortest time as possible. I disagree with that. And again, this is the part that's going to make me unpopular in certain groups, but that's okay because there's plenty of evidence to support what I'm going to say. And what I believe in from a longevity perspective, and I have a fellowship in anti-aging and metabolic medicine, right? So I can comfortably say that from an anti-aging perspective, maintaining hormone optimization is part of having your ideal health span and ultimately lifespan, with the concept that we're going to stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible, and then figuratively drop off a cliff, right? That's our goal in an anti-aging perspective. I didn't say literally, figuratively.
Right.
But that's the goal, right? You want to be healthy, feel great, be vibrant. And then when
just pass away in your sleep.
When it's time for you to go, then you're done, right? And nobody wants to drag out death for 20 years. It's just miserable. We all seen it. We don't want that for ourselves or for anybody that we love. So hormone optimization is part of that. So I already told you that oral birth control is a risk factor for bone loss, and yet it's being used in the period in which women are already starting to rapidly lose bone. So for me, that's a lose-lose. And there is an alternative, but it's not an alternative that OBGYNs are trained in, and it's not something that they're comfortable in. And that's the concept of bioidentical hormone replacement, which is using bioidentical hormones in the form in which your body understands and knows them, but you're getting them from an outside source. So that's progesterone as an oral capsule, that's estrogen as a cream, usually in the form of both estradiol and estriol. So your body is getting what it knows, still getting it from the outside. So it's not natural necessarily, but it's bioidentical. And then the estrogen can do what it does, the progesterone can do what it does, and you can balance those, which in that perimenopausal window is so important because your hormones are doing this. They're up and down, they're up and down. That's why you have hot flashes one day and then not the next. Once you get postmenopausal, that gets a little bit more consistent. It's much easier to do, but this is definitely part of what we do all the time for women, especially in the bone health space. So I have this conversation every day.
All right. Well, good. Well, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but I'm glad that you were able to do that. And I appreciate too, I think we all have such unique bodies. And I think that these are good conversations to have with your provider to figure out the best way of doing that with your goals in mind. And so, just to kind of put that out there as a blanket statement, but that's good to know. And it sounds like if we are concerned about bone health as it relates to birth control pills, then talking with our provider about bioidentical hormones might be a good solution to reach the goals that we have, to feel better and not.
Yeah. And I'm kind of smirking as you say that because it really depends on your provider. And so let me just speak on that a little bit. And so, okay. As I mentioned, OBGYN providers, traditional MD or DO trained OBGYNs are not going to be trained in bioidentical hormones because it's just not part of the training, or at least it hasn't been in the past. And I don't expect it to be in the future. The reason for that is that we as traditional physicians, and I practiced in that healthcare space for 7 years before making this big leap of faith. In the traditional space, we have a very high patient load. We have very little time to see patients. So we are really trained on rapid diagnosis, rapid treatment. And that rapid treatment generally doesn't involve patient education because that takes time. Maybe we'll have team members for that, nurses, nutritionists, dietitians. But in general, the physician is rapid diagnosis, rapid treatment. That rapid treatment generally comes in the form of pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals we're trained in are things that are FDA approved, made by drug companies, and bioidentical hormones and compounded topics are not in there. It's just not. Okay. And they have solutions that are commercial, that are readily available, and they're comfortable with those risks. It doesn't mean they're the best option. It just means that's what they're trained in. So if you go to your OBGYN and you say, I want a compounded hormone for whatever reason, you're not likely to have a very positive conversation. And that, again, that's not a slight toward them. That's just how they're trained. And that's what I would have said 10 years ago too. That's just what we're comfortable with. And then I also just want to be really clear that hormone replacement is not FDA approved for osteoporosis. And so FTC will come knock on my door if I say that that's true. But we can talk about, from a metabolic perspective, what the impact of hormones do have on osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And we'll just leave it at that.
And this is something, I want to later give you an opportunity to talk more about what you offer, but this is something Sure. that you do with your clients.
Correct. And we do it. When I say that we use hormones, we look at bone health through the lens of longevity. So I can very comfortably say I am providing you with bioidentical hormone replacement for likely symptoms of menopause. It is also going to have an impact on all these other areas in your life, because we know that, it's libido, it's skin, it's heart health, it's dementia prevention, right? Like it's the full package, but yes, it is going to have an impact on your bones too.
Got it. Okay. You talk some about bone health optimization. So talk to us some about what that means to you and things that we can do in our daily rhythms to optimize that.
Yeah, there's so much you can do to optimize bones without getting fancy, without hormones. We also, we talk about advanced things like peptides and, the pharmaceuticals is a whole other conversation, but your bones are going to respond to your daily life. So if you eat a terrible diet, you don't have micronutrients, you don't have vitamin D, you don't consume any calcium, you don't consume any protein, and you sit on the couch all day, guess what's going to happen to your bones? They're going to become jello. Whereas if you are pushing as heavy a thing around at some point throughout the day as you can, if you are doing some kind of impact, if you're consuming a protein forward diet, preferably from animal protein, and you're getting all the micronutrients that you need, then guess what's going to happen to your bones? They're going to respond to that and they're going to get stronger. So there are a lot of things that you can do throughout the day that are going to positively impact your bone health over time, but it does take time.
And then you talk some things, or you mentioned pushing heavy things,
Yeah.
moving heavy pieces of equipment. So let's move into that with in terms of muscle mass and how that will affect bone density. And so this is something that I have seen. People think, oh gosh, I've been diagnosed with osteopenia. I've been diagnosed with osteoporosis. I need to strength train.
Mhm.
And then they're like, well, now what? Um, and they don't, I mean, again, until I started doing this, I didn't realize that there were really kind of some specific things that we need to be doing. So for people who are, I mean, I have a pretty active community and they're pretty health minded. So what kind of things that would look, first of all, talk about how muscle mass does affect the bone density. And then secondly, what can we be doing to optimize that?
Yeah. So this is one of those contradictions that I see people struggle with, which is they go to their doctor, they get a diagnosis of osteoporosis. They're told three things: resistance training, calcium, and vitamin D. But then they're also told, oh, but don't lift anything more than 3 pounds. Right. And then they get that. They're like, they walk out and they're like, well, wait, what am I
Mhm.
supposed to do? Like, wait, what? And so, yeah, everybody's different. And this is where we struggled early on when we created the program of giving specific recommendations, because I don't know what your risk of fracture is. I can look at all the data and I can guess, but I really don't know. So I can't tell you if you're doing, especially with poor, posture and you don't have the right form, how much can you lift? I really don't know. That's where we really relied on local people, somebody working with you to say, okay, this is the form, this is the move, and so forth. We have since been able to create a relationship with a program you may have seen actually some training for called Buff Bones. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'll have to check it out though.
Yeah, check it out. So the founder of that company, Rebecca Rothstein, she now sits on our advisory board, and so we've kind of onboarded that program. But it's a Pilates based program. Starts really simple. It talks a lot about form. It's something that really most people should be able to do. And then it gets into resistance training, and once you have the form, it kind of walks you down this pathway. So I'm comfortable offering that to people without me sitting there watching them working out. For people that don't have access to that, we say you need to lift as heavy as you can without hurting yourself, because we know as we get older, injuries take so long to recover from, and all of the fractures have potential impact and could take a really long time to recover from. So definitely want to try to avoid that. Start slow, start low, build over time. And then if you don't have access to somebody, there are a number of online resources, but make sure they're specific to osteoporosis, right? Like
Mhm.
I really encourage people to do stuff at home. I mean, I'm sorry, with a provider locally. But the whole goal is to do two things, really. One is to build muscle mass, as you mentioned. Muscle mass has an impact on bone because the way that the muscles and the bones work together. Obviously, muscles drive bone movement, right? When you lift your shoulder, it's your deltoid pulling on your humerus, it's lifting your arm. Those attachments where those muscles are attaching to the bone, when they're pulling on the bone, it's imparting stress. And I said early on that stress is responsible for bone development. So the bigger your muscles are, the harder they pull, the more bone you're going to build over time. And we see this really clear association with muscle mass, or rather actually loss of muscle mass and loss of bone mass. And so the technical term sarcopenia, or loss of muscle mass, is strongly associated with bone density, which makes sense, right? If you have sarcopenia, you're very likely to have osteopenia and osteoporosis. So then one of the things that we do is to try to help people to build muscle mass. Part of that is actually doing resistance training, but the other part of that then, of course, is nutrition. And then it ties back into hormones. What's one of the best hormones for building muscle mass is going to be testosterone. Again, not FDA approved for that. So that's kind of the comprehensive thing. And so then the other part of building bone from an exercise perspective is going to be impact. And this is where I'm really careful of saying, go do impact training. If you don't know what your bone density is, you don't know what your risk is, don't go do impact training. But if you look at the research on impact training, it shows that impact training combined with resistance exercise is going to have a greater impact than especially aerobic exercise, but even resistance exercise on its own.
This is very similar to what what I have been learning, which is always good. So one thing too, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're talking about those your muscles and lifting heavy things where those muscles are kind of pulling away from your bones, not to get too much into the weeds, but that will also release those osteoblasts, which can help build the
Right.
bone as
Yeah,
well.
it's a little less clear, but I mean, that would be the mechanism, right? And I
Right.
don't think we
Okay.
have good data to say that that's exactly how it happens, but it makes sense that if you're creating that environment and you're creating the stimulus, then the osteoblasts have to be, from the stem cells have to be, brought out of the weeds.
Okay. All right. So now what if someone is listening and they think, but I've already been diagnosed. I've already been diagnosed with osteopenia or porosis. What do I do now? And can I reverse this? What is your guidance with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that osteopenia is actually really misunderstood. I think that people say, "Oh my gosh, I have osteopenia." Well, like I said, I have osteopenia, right? And
Mhm.
I'm not at risk of fracture. I think that if you have a diagnosis of osteopenia, and also I was looking this up today, osteopenia is not actually a medical problem, right? Osteopenia is the precursor to diabetes. I mean, sorry to diabetes. I was just thinking pre-diabetes and diabetes.
Yeah.
Precursor to osteoporosis. Osteopenia is potentially a problem if 2 years ago you didn't have osteopenia, right? So you have an interval that says that you are losing bone mass quickly, and that happens. So that could be a problem. But if you have mild osteopenia and you're not at risk for fracture, this is not something to lose sleep over. So I think we have to understand it in context. Let's say your T score is negative 1.5, like I think mine's negative 1.2 or 1.3. But it's been like that since I was 22. So over the last 20 plus years, it hasn't changed. Am I at higher risk of fracture now than I was then? Well, only because I'm 20 years older, but I don't think my bone really has changed. If anything, it's probably gotten better. You have to really take that into context. So can you slow down bone loss if you have osteopenia? Absolutely. That's honestly the easiest thing to do. Because ultimately we're doing one of two things. We're either trying to slow down bone loss and improve bone building, or we're trying to, put the bottom on bone loss and really push bone building. But I always tell people it's easier to slow down bone loss and improve bone than it is to have a really bad diagnosis, a T-score, -4, -5, and then build up from there. Are both of those things possible? Sure. But the first scenario where we're slowing down bone loss and building bone is much easier, much faster, and you're going to reverse your osteoporosis, which I can talk about that definition, but you're going to reverse your osteoporosis faster. The reason why I used air quotes, if anybody's listening to this and not watching, is that reversing osteoporosis, I have to say carefully because, can you reverse that medical condition? Well, technically, yeah. If you get your T-score above negative 2.5, then you have technically reversed your osteoporosis. But what I'm really talking about is reversing the causes of osteoporosis, recognizing why you're losing bone, reversing those causes of bone loss, and then watching your DEXA, if that's your tool of choice, watching that improve over time. So when we onboard people for a 12-month program. Our goal is to recognize and reverse and then retest. So we don't necessarily get people all the way to their finish line, but we figure out where they are. We point them in the right direction, give them all the tools, and then let them go. And some people do stay with us for multiple periods of 12 months to make sure that they're getting there and to have all the tools, and that's fine. But we get people, especially recently, we've been getting, our sales team is getting a lot of people that are saying, well, what's the 5-year plan? What if I have to stay with you for 5-10 years? I'm like, whoa. Let's talk about this month. Because we can set you in the right direction and then we'll watch it improve over time.
And so when you talk about doing that, it's a combination of impact, like you're talking about, increasing your skeletal mass. What other things are involved? And so let's just take this as a segue into telling
Sure.
us some about your program with the R's. I'm sorry, I can't remember all of them off the top of my
Yeah.
head. And so tell us what a holistic look from that of their program would be like.
Yeah. So I know I talk a lot about the R's. So I was basically just trying to build some kind of framework to help people understand this. So we call it the 4R model. So we have 4Rs. So that's recognize, reverse, retest, and revive. And the whole concept, like I said, is to recognize why you're losing bone, reverse those causes of bone loss, retest to make sure we're heading in the right direction, and then revive your life and hopefully live without the fear of fracture. What that looks like in program mode is that once you're onboarded, you meet with our coaching team. I think accountability, having the right nutritional education is a big part of this. Now, not everybody needs extensive counseling and coaching and a lot of nutritional guidance, but they still need to have somebody to touch base with. And one of the things we've learned in the traditional medical model is that doctors are not good at that. And so what we've created is basically a layer of coaching that can help with all of those things. And again, a lot of these patients have gut dysfunction. They have food intolerances. We're helping to either test around that or to figure that out. But that's the first thing that happens is we do a lifestyle review. And then we're getting our extensive testing. So that can be as little as our extensive blood panel, which it's not a little, it's a lot, but it's a great starting point. Sometimes we need functional testing to go on top of that. And functional testing can include cortisol for adrenal function. It can include gut testing. It can include genetics. All those things are great and they give us more information, but we don't necessarily need them. It just makes it more specific and unique to you. But starting with the blood tests and the lifestyle information, then we create the plan. The plan is going to be really unique based on whoever we're working with. How long has it been since menopause? Are they on hormone replacement now? Have they ever been on hormone replacement? Are they really a candidate? Because not everybody is a candidate. And then, how comfortable are they with the concept of peptides? What is the current nutritional status? And so we basically create a program that includes all the lifestyle stuff. So those 4 foundational pillars, which are nutrition, exercise, sleep, and stress mitigation. So make sure all of those are nailed. And then a custom supplement plan, which is going to be based off of your needs, based off of the testing. And then we get into the more advanced stuff. And so you could actually just stop there and you can do the program and have the coaching and do the Buff Bones program throughout. And that's going to be a complete package. But the more advanced things that can be very impactful would be hormone replacement, which again, we're doing for multiple reasons, not just for your bones. That's a very powerful lever if you're a candidate for it. And then peptides, which we could have a whole conversation on, but those are additional levers that we can pull. And then because we're physicians, we have the ability to prescribe pharmaceuticals. Now, most of our patients don't want them, and I'm generally fine with that. I generally don't like most of the drugs, but there is a role for some of the drugs in some circumstances. And actually just had this conversation today. We have one patient that is on a pharmaceutical out of all of our bone health patients. And the reason why is because she had very severe osteoporosis. She is the primary income earner in her family, and her husband has dementia. And so she was at really high risk. And we said, look, the risk of you having a fracture right now is really high. This would be absolutely catastrophic for you. Let's pull every lever. So we did. Mm-hmm. We pulled every lever, and her scores look amazing. Right? She's just like a rocket ship headed in the right direction, which is awesome. But that's pretty rare that we would do that.
Well, that makes sense. And I like that you're taking into consideration the individual situations that people are in, because obviously that would be a pretty dramatic effect if she broke her bone or something like that. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned peptides a couple times, and I'm not familiar with that. Is it even possible to give us like a super high level of what that is and how that relates to this conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I love peptides. It's something that I had never been trained on or even heard about until I did a fellowship with the A4M group. And so peptides are these really interesting things that live in the space between nutraceuticals or supplements and pharmaceuticals or drugs, right? So they are prescription products that are made in compounding pharmacies, just like bioidentical hormones, but they are not made by drug companies, and therefore they are not FDA regulated. So they live in this kind of awkward space where people generally can't access them on their own. They have to work with a provider like myself who has been trained in them. I have a certification in peptides, and I can prescribe them and understand them and be comfortable with them. But some people get weirded out because they're not FDA regulated. But the truth is, drug companies don't want them because they're generally fragments of naturally occurring proteins. Because they're naturally occurring, they can't be patented. Therefore, drug companies don't want to use them because they can't make money on them. And so they're these kind of cool things that are just stuck in this kind of in-between gray zone. And so we use them really as adjuncts, mostly to help build muscle mass. So there are a number of different peptides we can use to help build muscle mass. There are peptides. I have a list. I don't even know how many long it is now, probably 30 or 40 different peptides that we can use for different reasons. But some of our go-tos are things that are going to help build muscle mass, going to help push the needle on being anabolic versus catabolic. Also for cognition, there's some really cool things for cognition because some of these patients are seeing some signs of early cognitive issues and cognitive decline. So kind of helping people, again, from a global perspective, some of those peptides also kind of cross over. They'll help you with cognition, but they'll also help you with bone development. So kind of fun things to utilize.
Oh yeah. Okay. That's cool. I haven't heard about that. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Okay. And then finally, I'm just curious because I love it when my guests can provide like, simple takeaways.
Sure.
What kind of dietary and or supplement changes would you recommend? You've talked about vitamin D and calcium a couple times. So talk to us some about that and anything else that you feel like are kind of good across the board ways of helping us develop or keep bone health.
Yeah, so I could talk about this all day, but I'll try to keep it short. Um, and I'll just say too, I'll kind of plug our own channels. The YouTube videos that I'm making right now, we have this whole campaign right now of making YouTube videos. So we get pretty in depth on a lot of this, but the summary around nutrition is for me, and again, this actually makes me relatively unique in this space. I really believe that we need to eat a protein forward diet to support both our muscles and our bones. I see this very commonly that people are with osteoporosis. They're going on this health kick, and because of a lot of the noise that's out there, people will say, "Oh, well, I should eat a plant-based diet because it's going to improve my body pH, and I'm going to therefore improve my bones." And I have an entire video on the whole concept of pH balance and why that's most of that research has been misleading. Not to say that it's not true to some extent, but it doesn't mean that you need to cut out protein from your diet. It means that if you want to eat fruits and vegetables, great. I agree with that. But don't cut out protein in order to improve your pH. You're definitely cutting off your nose to spite your face. So eat a protein adequate diet. I like animal protein because I think it's easier to get adequate protein from animal sources than from plant sources. If you're trying to get, so just me as an example, probably not a good example, but I'm trying to get 200 grams of protein in a day. That's a gram per pound for me. Um, to do that from animal sources is challenging, but possible. To do that from plant sources, impossible because of the amino acid availability. Maybe it's not impossible, but it would be challenging.
It's hard.
So I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm saying that most people that make that move end up eating a higher carbohydrate, more highly processed diet, and they come to me and they're extremely protein malnourished, and that is not good for your bones. So that's kind of my big diet takeaway. And then from a supplement perspective, boy, if you look online of supplements for bone health, boy, you could end up with 30 different things in your cupboard. So what are the big players? You probably need vitamin D. We test vitamin D on everybody, and pretty much everybody's globally deficient unless they're already replacing it. So the question then is how much? It is a fat soluble vitamin. You can overdose in it. And so you do have to be careful. I do recommend testing it. So for my patients, we really push the lever on this. We get their levels to 80 to 100, but we're testing all the other labs to make sure that nothing is getting out of where it should be. If you're not testing, I wouldn't really probably go over 1 or 2,000 IU a day, but we can push people to 5,000, 10,000 a day because there's a lot of variability in absorption and utilization of vitamin D.
But that should not be self-managed, you're saying.
Again, like if you're taking 1,000 IU a day, you're not going to get over probably 30 or 50, right? So you're not going to get in trouble doing that. If you're taking 10,000 a day and you're not checking your labs, potentially, although I think it's probably more rare than we think, but it's possible. And then vitamin K is, people will hear a lot about vitamin K. There's a lot of fear around vitamin K. I'm preparing for a video on this, but really you want to look for vitamin K2 because K1 is what you get in plants and you have to convert it to K2 and it's not easily done. And so vitamin K2, and then specifically, if you guys want to write this down, MK7 as opposed to MK4. So K2 is MK7, has a longer half-life. It's not necessarily that easy to find in supplements right now, but somewhere between 200 and 300 micrograms of K2 is MK7 to go along with your vitamin D to help you to absorb it, to utilize the calcium and put the calcium in the right place. That's a really great starting point, just that. Okay. Calcium is very controversial. So I think you should calculate how much calcium you're getting. And then if you need more calcium, the form of calcium I like is calcium in the form of hydroxyapatite. So that's MCHC. And the reason why I like that is that's how it exists in your bones. So lots of different forms that you can get. Good evidence and research to say that form is going to absorb best and improve your bone density more than other forms. I could really just keep going.
I really want you to, but I also have to honor your time. And I think this is a great opportunity to you mentioned your YouTube channel. We will have that in the show notes, but say really quickly for those who can't access the show notes where they can find all of your information on YouTube.
So just look up Dr. Doug Lucas, and I think it's just DRDOUGLUCAS.
All right. Sounds good. We'll definitely link that. You've provided that, so that'll be in the show notes. Okay. I really could, like, this is fascinating to me, and I'm so thankful for your time, but I have to wrap it up because I know you're a busy guy. So I have a few questions I ask all of my guests. One of them is, I love learning about people's tattoos because I have found that often when people put something on their body for the rest of their lives, they have a meaning behind it. So I was wondering if you have any tattoos, if you would mind sharing one and the meaning behind it. And if you don't have one, but you had to get one, what would it be and where would it go?
I don't have a tattoo. And for the longest time, I really felt like, the body is a beautiful creation. And this is what, God made for us in his image. And why would I tattoo that? What I've since learned as I've gone through life is that really this body, this vessel is just that. And, we have incredible experiences throughout life, and sometimes they're worth remembering. Sometimes the lessons are worth noting and reminding yourself of on a regular basis. So I actually am planning on getting a tattoo. I don't know when or if, probably, but this tattoo that I have in my mind would be a combination of burning ships. So in the kind of the cliche of burn the boats, you're familiar with that topic. For me, this represents leaving orthopedics and walking away from a relatively lucrative, stable income practice to create something that most people told me would never work. And so that is, I definitely, as I was making the shift, I was hedging my bets and I kept one foot in the door. And until I burned the boats and had to literally burn the bridges too, it wouldn't work. And so I had to truly leave, truly walk away, truly say, I will not work as an orthopedic surgeon in my area. So now I'm pretty sure nobody around here would hire me because I really did have to burn the bridges. So I would say burning the boats. And then also I love the image of a lion. I love what lion represents. And so I would probably have, the boats and the smoke forming a lion face somehow up there. And I would put it right there as a kind of an upper sleeve.
Kind of your lower shoulder. Awesome. Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. And that must have been so scary to walk away from what you worked so hard to accomplish. And yet here you are and impacting people's lives on a more individual basis, but probably a more impactful one as well. So congratulations on that. I'm happy for you.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell people really quickly how they can connect with you. We will have this in the show notes, and you mentioned the YouTube. Is there anywhere else that you would like to point people to connect with you?
Yeah, it just depends on how you want to consume materials. So our websites are optimalbonehealth.com. We also have the health optimization side called optimalhumanhealth.com. But if you're going bone health, look at optimalbonehealth.com. And then we mentioned YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. It's the same Dr. Doug Lucas. There's an underscore between the DR and the Doug Lucas on Instagram and Facebook. And we're trying to put as much content out as we can and growing our team to help do that. So definitely follow and watch as it grows.
Will do. And those links will be in the show notes. Okay. Do you have a meaningful Bible verse that you would like to share with us?
I do. So it's funny that when I saw that, I've had this written on my dream board. Actually, I have it right underneath the word dream board. And it's from Proverbs, and it goes, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. And I've had that written there since I made the decision to truly burn the boats and just say, this is my calling.
Awesome. I trust you. I trust you. That's fantastic. And then I'm going to let you have the final say. What is the one simple thing you would like my community to remember about this conversation?
People get so dependent on the system, the healthcare system, to provide them with all the guidance that they need. And while our system has some great things and doctors in general have all the best meaning and purpose in the world, but you have to be an advocate for your own health. If you have osteoporosis, if you have osteopenia, any of the other numerous medical conditions that our system doesn't do a great job of managing, do your own research, find somebody that you trust and suck everything you can out of them to help improve your own health. Because our system is just not designed to do it for you. You have to do it on your own.
So good. Okay. That's all for today. Go out there and have a great day.